Welcome to the conversation hosted by the pastors of the Kansas Avenue Seventh-day Adventist Church, which is located in Riverside, California. I am Michael Jenkins, the administrative pastor, and I'm partnering on screen. Who will be coming on in just a moment with me is our youth pastor, Pastor Edmund McBride. And behind the scenes, keeping the stream on track is the Kansas Avenue senior pastor, Pastor Dr. Elder Keith Morris. And we are back. Now, we took a break during the month of January during this year, but we're back. And what a month to be back, Black History Month. Now, all of you joining me today are Black. And just like me, you're Black, but in February, I am Black. And during this month, the conversation is we're going to talk about issues that are relevant to Black people living in the United States. And we're starting with a strong topic today: tensions, a conversation about intra-racial tensions between Blacks in America. And I don't know if we're going to have enough time to get to everything, but we're going to try our best. Before we get started, I need all my viewers to do me a favor. Share this link with someone. Share it to your Facebook page or drop the link in someone's in a message or a text or an email. Also, if you have any questions, feel free to type them out in the comments on Facebook or YouTube, and we'll do our best to allow our panelists to respond. Now, we've got a good one. So without any further ado, I want to have a word of prayer, and then we will introduce our guests. So wherever you are with me, just bow your heads and let's pray to get the conversation started. Father in heaven, we want to thank you for allowing us to come together at this very hour. And I pray that all those listening, Lord, would not only hear our voices, but that they would hear your voice as you speak to us during the conversation today. Give us some greater understanding as we not only celebrate Black culture here in America, but as we seek to have a better understanding of the intercultural relationships within Black culture in America. We thank you now in the name of Jesus, we pray. Amen. All right, I want to introduce our guests. Oh, man, this panel today and all month long, we have some great individuals. First, I want to introduce Sister Dilys Brooks. She is the campus chaplain of Loma Linda University, where she provides spiritual care for the students, the faculty, and the staff. And she's been happily married to my friend, her husband, Dr. Delroy Brooks, who's pastor of the Juniper Avenue Seventh-day Adventist Church in Fontana, California. They've been married for 24 years, and they're blessed to be the parents of two children, Micah and Matea. Currently, Dilys is a PhD student in practical theology at Claremont School of Theology at Wilmot University. She's also an avid gardener, cook, baker, and knitter. And we have Rashida Sanchez, and she is a first-generation child of Haitian immigrants who migrated to the United States in the 1980s. She's a member of the Shiloh Bilingual Seventh-day Adventist Church, which is located in Brooklyn, New York. New York, stand up. Rashida is also a certified fellow of thanatology through the Association of Deaf Education and Counseling, and currently works as a bereavement counselor. So we look forward to her perspectives today. And Dr. Carole Woolford-Wint, she's a PhD she holds, and she's a psychologist, an educator, a researcher, a diversity specialist, and a social justice educational activist. She's the chair and an associate professor of the Department of Graduate Psychology and Counseling at Andrews University in Berrien Springs, Michigan. And also coming from Andrews, we have Michael Nixon, Esquire. Michael is the vice president for diversity and inclusion at Andrews University. He began this work at the age of 29 and is the first to serve in this position at Andrews. He's also an adjunct professor in the History and Political Science Department, where he also advises pre-law students, and we're glad to have him with us. And we have Dr. Leslie Pollard. Dr. Pollard, many of you know, is the president of Oakwood University. That is my alma mater. And Dr. Pollard has been a pastor, and he's worked in education for many, many years. And he has been the president of Oakwood for many years now. And we are glad to have Dr. Leslie Pollard with us today. And we also have Dr. Clifford Jones. I served as Dr. Jones administrative pastor or assistant when I was at Andrews, and he was a professor there. And I think he's the vice chair of the entire seminary there. For a while, but he is now the president of the Lake Region Conference. And Doc Jones, it is good to be with you again and to have you as part of the conversation today. And we have Dr. Jerome Crichton, who is no stranger to the conversation. He is a regular with us. He is the founder, pastor, and CEO of Every Word Ministries, which is a self-supporting 501c3 community-based ministry in Pittsburgh, California. He also serves as the adjunct professor of psychology at Alliance International University in San Francisco, California, and is an adjunct professor of psychology at Diablo Valley Community College in the Contra Costa Community College District. Dr. Crichton, is the author of the Crichton Model of White Pathology. I'm sure we'll hear some of that today, and the Cultural Educational Transformation Model, both of which are used to address cultural change narratives. And I hope that I have gotten everyone that is with us today, and you all are welcome to the conversation. I'm glad that you are with us. So now let's get started. So our first question, here it is. While preparing scripts for the promotional flyer, myself, Pastor McBride, and Pastor Morris, we sit down together and we brainstorm and we try to, think of topics and different things. And while we were preparing the promotional scripts, we were reminded of the shortcomings in labels often used to define Blacks in America. So we started this discussion with this question. What would you say are the best designations for the different segments of Blacks living in America? What is the best designation for the different segments of Blacks living in America? Anybody want to tackle that? Who wants to be first to kind of address this? We have Blacks, we hear African American, we hear Caribbean American, and then when we talk about the Caribbean, we have individuals from St. Thomas and Trinidad and Barbados and Jamaica, and we have individuals from all over the place. And then we talk about different African countries, and we talk about individuals who may have been born in another country but now live here, or individuals who were born here, but because of their upbringing in their household, they may be heavily Jamaican or Trinidadian or Nigerian. Come on, talk to us. What is the best designation for different segments of Blacks living in America? I'm gonna pick on somebody. Doc Pollard. Doc Pollard, I know that you've done some studies in diversity.
Not to be clever, but Blacks in America works for me because
right.
it's specific enough to provide a racial designation, which we generally accept. And then it's broad enough to include the incredible diversity that's represented within that racial family. So for me, Blacks living in America works. And then, of course, we know that there are all subsections and subgroupings within that general designation. So,
yes.
Of course, if you go by the U.S. Census, it'll say African American / Black, right? So. But I'm interested in what my colleagues think. But that works for me. That works for me.
Okay. I'm gonna ask Doc Nixon to chime in, if you don't mind. I know you work in diversity as well. When you're dealing with this topic on campus, what kind of designations do you run into, and what would be your best response?
Yeah, and again, thanks for having me in the conversation. And it looked like my colleague, Dr. Woolford-Wint, was going to jump in, so maybe I'll yield to her in a moment.
Okay.
She works with me here on campus and has been a champion of diversity here for a number of years before I arrived. But I agree with Dr. Pollard. I think that Blacks in America works well. On campus, we often talk about being members of the African diaspora. And so that's a designation that I think works well for us. Because as a part of our Black History celebration on campus, we're intentional about highlighting and edifying all the different parts of that diaspora and looking at all of the different expressions that come out of Blackness, and in some ways sort of reclaiming the label that was meant to designate us all in a certain pot, and taking that back and helping people see and understand the beauty and complexity and nuance and diversity of Blackness. And so I think Black in America, the African diaspora, of course, there are other terms, but they're probably speaking more to a subset of folks who would fit under the Black designation. So that's typically how I approach it.
Okay. And Dr. Woolford-Wint, we do want to hear from you, but let me throw this piece of the question in there. From the responses that we've heard so far, is this just an umbrella term when we talk about, Black? Is that good enough, or do we need to make separate designations?
Well, first of all, I'd just like to once again say thank you for inviting me to the conversation. This is a great experience, and to be on this with so many great minds. So I think you're going to have a difficult time because we're all going to want to hear what everybody else is saying. Now, with regards to this question, I think that what was said by the previous speakers, I agree with totally, that the Black designation is inclusive. It's inclusive of Blacks from all regions of the world, and many different experiences. And one of the things I think that we have to fight against and make sure that we push back hard on it is that when the designation was given to us, and it's changed over the years, it's Blacks, it's Negroes, it's, colored people, it's been changing all the time, but the designation is meant to try and make us a monolithic group, and to deny the diversity that's within our group. And so I think that the best terminology to use with people is the one that they subscribe to. I do not believe that we should be forcing people into categories to try and make it all one group, so that a monolithic group, so that we don't value or celebrate the differences that are within our group. We're just like with white people as a group. We don't think that Italian whites are the same as American whites, or American whites are the same as British whites. We acknowledge that, and people just automatically assume that there are going to be differences with those. But when it comes to Black people or people of the African diaspora, it's often thought of as, well, it doesn't matter where you come from, it's going to be exactly the same. You're one group. So I like the idea of using the inclusive term of Blacks, but then allowing people to give themselves the little bit of self-determination in how you describe it. And I'm from England, London, England, and I say, yes, I am Black when I'm put into the Black group. But I say, no, I am not African American when I'm automatically put into the African American group, as if all Blacks are only from Africa, are African American. So yeah, we should be able to be in the umbrella, but also have our individuality expressed.
Okay. I'm going to move on to the next question, unless there's someone else with the... Yeah, go ahead, Doc Jones.
If I may, first off, let me express deepest appreciation to you and Doc McBride and lead pastor, Doc Morris, for the invitation and to participate on this distinguished panel. What works for me is Black or of African descent also works for me. At the end of the day, we are all, if we have any measure of color in us, we are a descendant of the great continent of Africa. So descendant of Africa also works for me. Thank you.
All right. I believe, Mr. Dilys, that you had a comment to add to this part of the discussion. All right.
I was actually going to venture to say that in that statement, agreeing with all who spoke before me, but the terms Blacks in America, it's what we're here to talk about. I think the in America part is the one that's most interesting as we really move towards how that ethnic designation is really experienced by the variety of Black groups which are here. So it'll be interesting to see where we go from there.
All right. Well, let's go on to the next question and keep it moving. I want to thank you all for your responses. And, I do agree that Black, I'm good with that I'm Black. We're all Black, but there are different, categories that we can place ourselves in. But overall, I'm good with the term Black and the overall umbrella. But this next question says, what does Blackness mean to different segments of the Black population? What does it mean? Why do people take great care to make distinctions between ethnicities? And, for an example, if we do a roll call, if we're in church, especially during Black History Month, and we do a roll call and we say, how many of us are from Jamaica? Half the church will stand up, right? How many of us are from Trinidad? How many of us are from Barbados? How many of us are from England? And we love these distinctions. We just talked about the umbrella of the term Black, but why do we make distinctions between ethnicities? And I think Doc Pollard, I think you're talking, but we don't.
You're muted. There you go.
There you go.
I think because the distinctions exist. I think we live in the multiple realities that, I work and live here at Oakwood University. 95% of the people who live and work and attend school here are Black. 54 different countries are represented. We live and work together in the same space every single day. We do all of the identities, and we do them affirmatively because that's a part of who we are. And so I think for me, when we do this, when we do this very thing that you're talking about, we do roll call during Black History Month, Jamaica, Trinidad, Kenya, Nigeria, and it's fun, but it's wonderful. It shows the beauty. It shows the diversity within our community. I always say to people who like to criticize Oakwood and say, well, I need a more diverse experience. I say, well, is 54 countries diverse enough for you? Is that diverse enough for you? When we do the roll call and I say, Viva la Haiti, and everybody, yeah. So again, I think we're really getting into very deep sociology here and psychological self-awareness. And I think all of that. So to answer your question, why do people celebrate? Because again, it's a part of who we are. It's a part of who we are. If you talk about Louisiana, there's an excitement when I think about gumbo and the Saints and all those other things, right? That's who I am too. I'm not just one thing. That's who I am too. TOO. That's who I am too.
Yeah, if I may, first of all, thank you for inviting me to come back. I feel good that you invited me back. I think that there may be something missing from this conversation. And that there is a layer of complexity when we talk about these designations. Black speaks of an experience. African speaks of an origin. And I think we have to be careful not to simply conflate the two as if they are the same, right? And so we have to keep in mind that when we use this broad designation as Black, we're talking about an experience, and that is largely determined by the oppression that people of African origin, that you go to origins, have experienced in this world. Now, bringing that to the question that you just asked, it's natural for people to gravitate on a social level with people who share a similar experience. This is at the root of culture and ethnicity. So it's just a natural consequence of being human. It's in every people group, whether you want to start at a parish or a geographical region or a specific city or the high school you went. It's just a part of natural phenomenon of being human.
All right, let's keep this going just a little bit before we move on to the next. I think there was, So Dilys, go ahead.
So because we don't have a whole lot of time, thank you for the invitation to be in this August group of individuals. And since we don't have a lot of time, I just want us to just jump right into the tensions conversation. I appreciated Dr. Crichton giving us those two words, those two definitions of Black being experience and African being origins. Because as a first generation immigrant, I have just started telling people that I'm from the Caribbean publicly in the last maybe 4 or 5 years. I intentionally have identified as an African American in most spaces because, one, I understood that I would be treated differently by the majority population if I identified as a Caribbean Black. Because the assumption was that being from the Caribbean, you're exceptional. And the more I understood about African American history, I made a decision at a very young age that I would not be a part of the division story and that I would identify with what I looked like when I walked into a majority white spaces. And so if we're going to talk about tensions, I'd really love to hear us jump into that part of the conversation. Because while it is true, and I'm careful about telling people the island that I come from, because I know my people, and we're a little bit much.
Now, I want to dig into that, because to realize that at a very young age, and to say and to make a decision at a young age that I'm going to identify with African Americans, instead of my Caribbean heritage. You're saying that you didn't want to be part of the division, but you recognize that something was there, right?
Yes.
So the question that I want to throw out there and ask, and then we can all just talk about divisions themselves, but stereotypes, because there are various stereotypes that contribute to these divisions. Some of those stereotypes, like you said, is from the or individuals from the Caribbean are seen as exceptional, while African Americans might be seen as lazy. You hear it a lot. I'm Caribbean, or my father was Caribbean, so he had 13 jobs. But then you think of somebody who's African American, who was born here and their lineage is here. They're not necessarily, trying to work and trying to do a lot of things. And those are stereotypes. So can you all just talk to me about some of these stereotypes that lend themselves to these divisions? And Dilys, what was it that helped you to see the division that you talk about? How did you notice these divisions? What sort of stereotypes were talked about in your home and that you saw at church or other places? You can begin to talk about that, and the rest of you just jump in and let's talk about some of these stereotypes and how do we get past them?
Thank you so much for that, Mike. I'm chuckling when I think about all the conversations you and I had at seminary with our other friends about this very topic years and years ago. And I think of Dr. Pollard and I sitting in the dean's office and having a conversation. And it wasn't lost on me that we would be in this space doing this thing right now. I grew up in Jamaica. I am what Malcolm Gladwell calls an outlier, because at the time that I grew up in Jamaica, we were in the process of transitioning from being tested externally by the British, because we were a former British Commonwealth, and we started taking the Caribbean exams. I was part of the second group of people who took that exam. And so I had the pleasure and the fortune of reading Chinua Achebe's Things Fall Apart when I was 13 years old. I had the opportunity to read Caribbean authors, where before that, my parents and my parents' parents, who happened to be able to go to school, were reading only British literature, British poems, and then being tested, right? A Man for All Seasons, Shakespeare, etc. And there's nothing wrong with that kind of literature. It just didn't speak our story. When I first was invited to come to the United States, I was 12. And so I made my entry here because we were given an opportunity to come to the United States because my mother was invited to come and become a nurse here. And there are a lot of political stuff. We don't have time to unpack all of that. But starting to come here at 12, growing up in a household where we had real conversations, graduating high school 16, and then having a senior friend say to me, when you go to the US, your white professors are going to treat you differently if you say you are from Jamaica. So you're going to have to decide if you're going to identify as a Jamaican or as an African American. That happened my first semester. One of my teachers had visited Jamaica and loved Jamaica, and he treated me differently than my classmates. And from then on, I said, I'm dropping my Jamaican accent. I'm going to identify as African American. Primarily because I understood that before I opened my mouth, I was going to be identified. And whatever privileges I would have gotten because I was seen as an exceptional Black person wasn't worth it. And so that's why I made that decision. And I'm telling you, I have only been publicly naming that I'm Caribbean American in the last maybe 4 or 5 years. I'm not sure what my partners, my colleagues on the line, what they're
I want to hear from everyone else. I've known you for quite a while, and growing up here in America, I can a lot of times hear, even in individuals' voices, some accent from another country, and I don't know if it's because I've known you a while or what, but I can attest that you haven't, really said, now because I've known you, I've known where you're from, but I can attest that publicly you haven't said, a lot about it. And, for me to hear you say that in the last couple of years, you just started to tell people is really eye-opening and mind-boggling at the same time. And there's a question that I want to throw out there to go along with this question about stereotypes and these tensions that brew. Is it okay to take advantage of some of the privileges that may be afforded to you because you may be from another place? Is that okay? I think, Dilys, you decided that it's not okay for me.
if I
But
may,
is it okay for anybody? Go ahead.
if I may, Pastor Jink, the stereotypes are real. They're both negative and positive. I think from the moment I landed here several years ago, I've heard the stereotypes. Foreign-born blacks are ambitious, they are proud, they are arrogant, they are stingy, they're non-race conscious, they're British. They identify with British stuff more than American stuff. You hear the stereotypes. You hear the stereotypes of the American blacks. They are lazy. They're looking for handouts. They're not as ambitious. And I've been exposed to these stereotypes in terms of my education, my doctoral programs. I remember a professor saying to me that he thought that West Indian students were a cut above the rest and wanted to treat me differently. And I resented that. I pushed back on that because I didn't want to be, to exploit that crazy thought on his part. But I was told that. You guys from the Caribbean, you bring more to the table. And I was told that on more than one occasion in terms of by professors. But I resented that, and I pushed back on that. So yes, the stereotypes are there. The stereotypes are there. It's a sad day when we as blacks ourselves begin to believe the stereotypes. We're told that we're different. We're different. You guys are different, you see. But we ought not fall for that. We ought not fall for that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, if I may interject here. So I want to step back a little bit and look at the big picture. And it seems to me that the experience of African people outside of the United States and inside of the United States is shaped largely by their own trauma and certain degrees of hypervigilance. That is to say that we are acting from impulses that are shaped within a social environment that is largely conditioned by colonialism. And that is why there are many West Indians who hold the British in very high esteem, emulate the British in many ways, and strive for those values that are associated with being British. And I'm speaking from experience here. And then in the United States, where you have Africans who don't hold those values, there is this tension, but this tension is largely shaped by what their experience has been in this country, which differs so much from the experience of Africans outside of the Americas, where, for example, they were forbidden to read, and they were declared to essentially be property, and the whole 3/5 human controversy, and other types of things that have shaped the hypervigilance out of which they operate. So we have essentially Africans outside of the United States who are operating out of a certain type of hypervigilance shaped largely by British colonialism, Spanish colonialism. And then you have Africans inside of the United States who are operating, out of a certain place of hypervigilance also. So the tension that exists is of necessity and can be subsumed under the aphorism, divide and conquer. It's inbuilt. It's inbuilt. And this is why the tension exists.
Yes, I was going to say exactly the same thing. I mean, the British they were very prominent in the whole colonization of the world. Their statement was, the sun never set on the British Empire, because that's how far-reaching their colonial efforts went, and they touched every region. And their motto, and they were very proud of it, was, you go to these countries, you go to these regions of the world, and you divide, and when you divide, you will conquer. Those were such powerful words and images in my childhood, as I realized that this thing is not happening by accident. this is very intentional, methodical, and calculated, the way that this has happened. And when you think about where we are now in relation to where we were when this all started, is that we've done a lot of work being able to fight for freedom, physical freedom from slavery. And we're still in the fight for physical freedom from mass incarceration. But the thing that we really have ahead of us is to fight the even bigger battle of psychological freedom from slavery and colonialism. We have all been socialized. We're all descendants of colonial history. And wherever we were, we've been socialized to incorporate, to take in all of the values, norms, and cultural aspects of the colonial powers. And so when we find ourselves here today and we're talking about Blacks from one region not valuing Blacks from another region, etc., it's all part and parcel of this divide and conquer. We were socialized to denigrate each other, just like we've been denigrated throughout the histories. And so we have been socialized to do that, and we continue to do that. It's amazing to me that on this panel, we've got so many people who recognized this attempt to divide and conquer. And so Chaplain Brooks said, oh, no, I won't be divided. I'm going to take this stance. But the majority of people out there who are listening and who are in our communities, they are not necessarily as aware of this technique, this policy that still persists up to today. And so that's why I think we still have so much tension between different groups within our churches and different groups within our schools, etc. One last thing I'd say, I get the opportunity in an educational setting to teach students. And so I work very hard in the classes that have a focus on this topic to talk about the issues of privilege and how all of us need to be able to acknowledge the privileges we have, and therefore understand that when there's a privilege given to one, that means the other group is underprivileged. And so I, as a foreign-born Black person from England, my experience in America is very, very different than the experience of an American-born Black person in this country. For me to do anything other than accept, acknowledge that is to be disingenuous, right? Because for me to say that it's the same or that we could compare, that would be ridiculous. I mean, from the time I open my mouth, and sometimes, funnily enough, even before I open my mouth, people are like, you're not from here. I don't know how they know, but they know. And it makes a difference because depending on what how they've been socialized around the British, and for most people in this country, they're positive attributes towards the British, except for if you're like Simon on The Voice, on America's Got Talent or something, you're kind of mean. But outside of that, British people are thought of as being bright and insightful, well-mannered, that kind of stuff. And so I get all of those stereotype privileges that are put on me, whether I'm polite or not, whether I'm bright or not, I get that. For me not to be able to acknowledge that is doing a disservice to my Black brothers and sisters in America who do not have that privilege. And I think that that's one of the things that I hope that people in the community, as they're listening to this, they begin to think about it. It's not that you can't buy into the narrative that Blacks in America are less than, because what you're buying into is to the colonial narrative, into the white supremacy narrative. You're buying into a lot of stuff if you believe that your Black brothers and sisters from America are less than anybody else.
Now, thank you for that. Yeah.
So may I?
Go ahead, please. Go ahead.
May I offer in response to what Dr. Woolford-Wint has said? I think one of the ways, Doctor, that we try to get to that conversation here at Oakwood in such diverse environment, so many of our young people coming from all around the diaspora, is to one of the texts that I now use since 2016 is Ibram Kendi's Stamped from the Beginning. Because see, part of the delusion is that the current overvaluation of any particular person outside America who is Black is really manipulative. Because when you go back to the root, the doctrine of biologically Black inferiority applied to all Blacks before there was a geographical distribution. And it's important, I think it's important to take us back to our history to see how the doctrine of manifest destiny and all of those other kinds of things feed to the valuation and then contribute to the divide and conquer. That's on one hand. The other piece of our history that I try to teach my students is to go back and to find the era when everyone's Pan-African, shop-worn term, but you understand what I'm saying, globally African diasporic consciousness awakens. Then you begin to see that whether it was Bob Marley, or whether it was Martin Luther King, or whether it was Malcolm X, right? Any of these great, we call them the great forefathers, or whether it was Kenyatta or any of the during the liberation period of the 60s, they all saw something in common. They saw that the enemy was in fact not each other, but the enemy was a colonialist philosophy that held at its core the inferiority of all Black people, whether we were in Jamaica or whether we were in Louisiana. It was held. It was held. And I think it's important then, for me, I never separate this conversation from our history, because that's where we begin to unpackage what did Sir Eric Williams see when he came to teach at Howard, when he was banished from teaching in England, as a matter of fact, because of his dissertation, right? His dissertation, which showed that it wasn't British moral impulses that led to the dissolution of British slavery. It was the fact that economically it had begun to not work for them. And just that dissertation had him banned from teaching in England. So he had to teach at Howard University. And he, a Trinidadian, said, Howard is the Negro Oxford. What did they see? They saw. And if we can help our people see, then we can have these conversations with ease and comfort, recognizing that when we talk with each other, as Dr. Norman Miles often says, we get along fine. It's when we listen to other people that we start turning on each other.
Yeah.
So I want to ask you all this question to begin to share some experiences and unpack an experience or two in which you and another Black person experienced tension in your interpersonal relationship because of cultural differences that we've talked about. And then tell us, what lessons did you learn from this incident? You know, whether you are American, you know, by birth, or West Indian, or British, or from a country in Africa, but you had tensions with someone else. Tell us about that incident. And then what did you learn, and how did your relationship either grow or suffer from that tension? Well, I'll start with just a quick example. And this happened recently, and I was a bit surprised that we ended up in this discussion. I was talking to a friend of mine from Jamaica, and this friend was telling me how Jamaicans are harder workers than Black Americans. And I was saying, are you seriously saying this to me? You know, all I've known are hardworking Black Americans. Every man in my family was a hard worker. My grandfather, my uncles, my father himself, all of them, hard workers. All I saw was hard workers. Now, I didn't see white collar workers, but I saw individuals who got up and worked multiple jobs, who worked hard at going to school. I saw this around me all the time, and I was relaying this to my friend, but this friend just kept on talking about how West Indians, it doesn't matter that, and this friend was saying that I'm the exception. And I was saying to this friend, and you've probably heard this argument before too, that many of the things that Black people from other countries enjoy in America are because of the hard work of Blacks in America throughout the years. And so I want you all just to share with us some experiences, and then how did your relationship grow? Hopefully it did grow. How did it grow, or how did it suffer?
I think Chaplain Brooks, for her experience, and just thinking about how at such a young age she was able to really say and adhere to the African American identity. Very different, as I was listening to her, about a first generation Haitian American who really adhered to the West Indian upbringing, whether it was culture, language, celebrations in Brooklyn of West Indian identity. I do think environment has to do with a lot of the ways in which we are brought up. And I hear education really playing a big role in this topic. Many of the conversations I have had are not with other Black individuals, but across generational lines, from individuals who migrated to this country, from West Indian persons who migrated to this country. And, specifically highlighting perhaps a lot of the Haitian story, there's a leaning into that stereotype because of the language. We're not colonized by the British. So it's not as easy to take away your accent while you're trying to wrestle and learn English in the first place. You're always identified as the other. And it's always very clear that you're other, even within the West Indian conversations. There's always an ideal of being the less than. But intergenerationally, and considering where many of West Indians I can speak for come from, there is divisions more not across the lines of Blackness or identifying as Black, but more along the lines of colorism, more along the lines of classism, more on the lines of who was educated, who was not, who was poor, who was not. So coming into the American milieu is very weird, considering that everything is centered around Blackness or around color. And there's a sort of missing of the inequities that Black Americans foundationally have had to face in this country. And so many of the conversations that I'm having now with older Haitians and people of my age, Zennials, Millennials, is a kind of awakening and coming into the fact that when you are walking down the street, like some of the panelists said, you are not necessarily seen as a person who has this diploma, who has been working hard, or who has this many jobs, etc. But you are identified by the color of your skin. My own father, driving a nice car, apparently too nice for a Flatbush neighborhood, and I think many of us have this story, pulled over, before he can even get a word out, identify himself, say who he is. There's already a presentation of who the police officer thinks he is. And having those conversations has been revolutionary, at least within my own culture and within my own friendship groups, about the fact that culture it can no longer be the glue that holds us together. We really have to be educated and understand and adhere to what Blackness means in this time.
Yeah, if I may, I'd like to suggest that while it may be helpful to look at the symptoms and the tensions and so on, I think it is much more fruitful for us to think about the etiology. What is the source or the origin? Right? Let's talk a little bit about that. At the root, no matter where the person of African descent is from, it's self-hatred that is born of the oppression of colonialism. And I don't think it's been given enough attention. And there are those who think that they don't hate themselves. And a part of the reason for that is that they don't understand the unconscious nature of self-hatred in many instances. And this is a consequence of the impact of colonization. Its manifestation, let's say in the West Indies, may be somewhat different from its manifestation here in the States. Pigmentocracy is one of those manifestations, or you can call it colorism, right? Pigmentocracy, colorism. These are manifestations that are commonly shared, but there are others that are more discrete, some being more prevalent in the West Indies and others being more prevalent in the United States. But at the end of the day, the root is the same. The root cause of the problem is the same. It's self-hatred. We've been taught to hate ourselves, and as a consequence, hate each other. And it is heightened by the geographical distinctions or the sound of the accent, or even the self-hatred is so deep, even the prominence of certain physical features amongst us. That's the root cause.
I so agree.
Definitely, and you're right on point with that. But I want to go back to this, asking for examples, and the end result, or the ending of giving an example, telling us how you grew from the conversation, from this tension that existed between you and another person. And now, and it's good that we're getting out the understanding that colonialism has contributed to this in a great deal. It's the root of the problem. And hopefully through the examples that we can give examples to other individuals who are watching, that when they end up in these situations, or maybe they were just recently in a situation, they can revisit a conversation with that person to try to work these things out and come to a greater understanding that, hey, this is self-hatred and we got to stop hating on each other, and hopefully grow from the tension and grow from working through the tension. And so that's what I'm asking for, just to throw out just a few examples of some conversations or some tensions that we each have had. I think there was someone else that was
going to
say something. I missed who that was.
If it were so simple, it would be okay. It's not quite that simple just to say we've got to stop hating each other. It sort of doesn't give the proper attention to the deep psychosis that manifests itself as self-hatred. And I think that if for no other reason, just to bring this to light, we have to start dealing with how we think about ourselves and the values that we hold relative to who we are. Because the idea that we can get along with people from other places, or we can somehow get to some kumbaya, that's well and good, but it doesn't solve the problem. We have a very serious problem with how we perceive ourselves and each other. And we need to get to the root cause of that in order to be able to have productive relationships.
I wanted to jump in and first just thank you so much, Rashida, for jumping in and sharing what you did. There are a couple of comments I've seen in the chat, and I hope, Michael, that the example that I'm going to give will help. A couple of minutes back, somebody asked the question, what's wrong with using the privilege that you have of being quote unquote exceptional? Well, in at the time that I came to the United States, which was over 20 years ago, as I shared, I intentionally chose to cast my lot with African Americans because I was code switching. It wasn't with Black people that I didn't tell them that I was from the Caribbean per se. It was when I was in a majority population space, right? It was being able to say, don't look at Black people as a monolith. We come from different places. It's the same thing with continental African folks, right? Because we haven't touched that either, because there's tension there as well. There's this idea that we're not like them. And as long as we remain uneducated, as long as we remain isolated in our own spaces, and when we don't learn about each other's stories and how colonization has completely ravaged our community, or if a Ghanaian was on here, they would say the Akan peoples, because before the colonizers carved up the continent, we were one people. And if I'm wrong with the word, somebody correct me in the chat. But if I read it properly, we were once referred to as Akan, one set of people, right? So that's one. Number two, I'll share my experience, Michael. I grew up in Jamaica, and I had negative stories about Haitians. I'd never been to Haiti, but all the stories that came back from the people who would go to Haiti, and these were our street vendors, right? We used to call them higglers. Now, those were our ambassadors to Haiti. They would go to Haiti, buy cheap goods, bring it back to Jamaica, and sell it. When they came back, the propaganda they came with were very unsavory, unsettling remarks about people of Haitian descent. I happened to come to the United States, and a family member of mine was dating a Haitian. So I had a firsthand opportunity to see for myself if what I had heard in the streets was true. Well, I noticed that the person was very kind and very generous and loving. And I realized, Dilys, the stereotypes that you had been given, you may need to deconstruct them. And worse, when I was with Haitian people, people spoke to me in Creole and they assumed I was Haitian. When I hung around Nigerian people, if they were Igbo, they would assume I was Igbo because I am light-skinned and my face is round. So my people must be from the East. So the only way, as Dr. Crichton is trying to get us to understand, this is not a simple one size, one answer fix situation. This is a generational problem that will take generations to change. But I think what we're modeling tonight is the place to begin. Speak, listen, learn. Done.
Yeah, I'll jump in real quick, and thanks so much for all you all who have shared. I'll start by sharing a quick story around tension. And so I have a good friend of mine. We're still good friends to this day, and he had moved here to the Bering Springs community from the African country of Cameroon. So he was Cameroonian, and became a part of our friend group. And so one day, at the time, one of the bigger hip hop artists at the time was 50 Cent. And, you know, the biggest song in the country was his song In the Club. And I know none of you have heard it because you're good Adventists, but I think I'm the youngest person on this call. I listened to it. Sorry. The Lord wasn't through with me yet. So we were listening to this song, you know, hanging out, chilling. And my friend was like, who is this? Who's this person? And we were like, what? You don't know who 50 Cent is? Are you serious? And literally, so like for the longest time, like we would not let him, we wouldn't let him live that down, essentially. And all these different stereotypes that had sort of been thrown at me about, you know, the continent of Africa and, you know, African culture and all this ignorance and things of that nature really started to raise to the surface until finally, after a good amount of time of this, I remember him, you know, talking with me and just saying, like, hey, Mike, like, you know, have you ever, you know, thought about what my culture is? You know, like you guys have talked to me a lot about like your culture. But have you ever wondered what kind of music that I listen to in Cameroon? And it really kind of shook me. And I just said, you know, I never really considered, because to me, really sort of being shaped in the African-American context, to me, Blackness, I mean, it was hip hop. It was, you know, all these different things that I knew to make me who I was as an authentically Black person. And someone not being hip to that was just weird to me. It was like, you know, where are you from? Like, who are you? You know what I mean? And so that opened up, just him asking that question opened up an opportunity for me to really get to know him and who he is and his family. And it actually opened my eyes up to the number of African persons who live here in our community and the different countries that they come from and what they bring to the table. And it really enriched my experience of being here, and really helps to inform the work that I do now. And so him really just asking that really good critical question helped me to pivot. One other thing I wanted to share really quick just about tension is that I've also really struggled with a lot of internal tension, and I think others have spoken to that. My mother she was born in Jamaica, was grown up in Jamaica, and is super Jamaican. She's authentically Jamaican. My father, as many of you know, is African American, and he's unapologetic about who he is and what he stands for. And so I was shaped a lot by that. And so what's interesting about my mother, I'll speak about her for a little bit, is that, you know, I really learned how to code switch from my mother. And so when she came into the States, she made an intentional, I think, decision to ensure that, you know, she was more likable or more malleable to sort of the American context and culture. And so that means for me growing up, you know, my mother's Jamaicanness, quote unquote, would come out in certain settings. So when we would go back home to New York and we'd be with my grandma and her sisters, she'd start talking, I didn't even know who she was. It was like, where's all that coming from? Like, she sounded like a completely different person, you know? Or when I was cutting up and I got in trouble, she started talking and the patois come out, and I'm like, Mom, I'm trying to answer your questions, but I don't understand you. Say that again. You know what I mean? And so, like, for me, interestingly, I mean, I connected to that through her, but I always kind of shied away from even claiming some of my Caribbean heritage or Jamaican heritage because I didn't feel authentic. You know, I didn't feel like I could really claim, like, I'd never been to Jamaica until, like, you know, within the last, you know, maybe 5-6 years. You know, we didn't make trips and stuff like that. And I felt disconnected. And so I just connected much more with my African-American heritage and, learning about our great figures and my dad sort of bringing me up in that mold. And so I think that I've always kind of struggled with that internal tension to where I never wanted to, be that person at Caribbean Impact. Dilys knows what I'm talking about, where that would just show up with the Jamaican flag all of a sudden out of the blue. But then the rest of the year, nobody knows I'm Jamaican. You know what I mean? So I think that I've been trying to rediscover, okay, how do I embody all the different parts of my Blackness and be authentic to who I am while also being proud of where I'm from, even if, all of the different things that make me may not show up on the surface.
I just wanted to jump in. I know we're running out of time, but I'm hoping that nobody said this, but I've had some real difficulties being dropped off of the line and back and forth. But another thing that I think is really important to think about when you're thinking about these struggles and differences. One, I think we've covered it a little bit, the issue of internalized racism, and all of us need to do a self-review of how much racism we have internalized, because that really shapes our worldview and shapes our behaviors and our relationships with others, depending on how much we've internalized of the dominant culture or the colonial background that we come from. So that's really, really important. And as I think about my experience growing up in England, it's funny because the people who are being viewed as hard workers and bright people in America, the Caribbean people, in Britain, not so much, okay? There were the people who were the Blacks who weren't, they were Black and, they were bad. It was bad to be Black. And that was that. So it brings me to my other issue, which I think is really important and that informs this discussion, is the issue of majority versus minority socialization. And I think that you find that when Blacks come from countries where they are socialized, that they were part of the majority, their socialization and who they are is very much more akin to whites who are in the majority. That's the socialization is the same. And Blacks come from places where they're the minority are socialized very differently. And so I felt coming to America that I had a kinship with African Americans because they, more so than Caribbean Americans or people from the Caribbean, because Caribbean, African, Haitian, they're all majority cultured people. They're more socialized as be the majority. But coming from England, I was definitely a minority in England and I was socialized from a minority perspective. And so it really kind of overlapped and gave me a heart for this work with African Americans because they are minorities within a majority culture. So I think all of these things just add to the complexity and the layers that we have to address if we are to move past this.
Brother Host, may I ask you a question, please? Yeah. And I want to ditto what everything that I've heard my colleagues say. May I just ask you a couple of questions for the next time we do this? Hopefully we'll do this again and continue this conversation.
We do need to do it again, yes.
Okay,
go ahead.
So number one, could we make sure that the next time we do this, we have continental Africans represented in the conversation? I hate to talk about people without them being at the table. That's one. The second is, could we also make sure that we have some sociologists and maybe even some specialists in immigration studies? Because so much has been discussed here from the little I know about that area really does conform to the frame of immigration. When one comes to a country, what does one try to do? Does one try to mainstream, right? Or does one identify with other causes that may take them out of the mainstream? Those questions have been explored, they've been answered. And I think it would be great to have either a sociologist or someone with some expertise there, because that's really the frame in which we're talking, it seems to me. So just a few requests, and hopefully, God willing, we can do this again with some of those other, and the other part, someone who is Afro-Latino needs to be in this conversation. Because I noticed when I lived in Southern California that if being Black can be a bind, try being Black with a Latino accent and see what that gets you, right? So again, as I think about the mix, how do we reflect the diaspora even in these conversations?
Yeah. And Doc, you just spoke to how great the diversity is amongst Black people, that we have a diverse panel here, but we haven't even scratched the surface of the diversity of Blackness. And there's individuals that we left out, not because we didn't want them here, but we don't even have enough space on StreamYard to host everybody here at the same time. But definitely we need to do this again. We've only scratched the surface today. We've talked about so much. In my mind, I've grown, I've learned, and I know that you all watching have done so as well. We've talked about this deep subject, and we've tried to dig into it, and we've tried to make it practical at the same time. But we do need more conversation about this topic, and we are going to come back. Now, it won't be next week because we've got all of February planned out. I'm going to tell you in a moment what is in store for next week, but we want to do this again. It doesn't have to be in Black History Month, because Black history happens all the time. We just emphasize it in the month of February. So all of you who are our panelists today, we want to thank you for being part of this esteemed panel today and blessing us with your wisdom and your knowledge and your expertise and your experiences. Thank you again so much. I can't say that enough. I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Pastor McBride, to give us a wrap up in just a moment. But let me tell you what's coming up on next week for those of you who will be tuning in, and we hope that you do tune in. Next week, we're going to be talking about race and policing. A conversation about the interaction of law enforcement with Blacks here in America. And we do anticipate having the chief of police from the Riverside Police Force with us. He has been with us in the past, and we're in conversation with him to come back on next week, and along with some other law enforcement officers, and also some social workers and some lawyers are going to be joining us on next week. So stay tuned to make sure that you're here at 3 p.m. Pacific time. Make sure that you mark that on your calendar in whatever time zone that you are in, so that you don't miss the conversation next week or any week throughout this month. It's going to be fantastic. It's going to be deep. We are going to learn, and we want to try to make it as practical as possible at the same time. Pastor McBride, I want to give it to you to give us a wrap up before we close up with a word of prayer.
Excuse me, I hate to be that person, but I'm going to be that person.
Go ahead. Tell us.
At my core, I'm an educator, so I just have to just throw this out. Dr. Pollard already told us about Stamped from the Beginning by Dr. Ibram X. Kendi. I would also highly recommend the book How to Be an Anti-Racist by Dr. Ibram X. Kendi. I'd also like to recommend the book The Warmth of Other Suns and the book Cast by, thank you so much, a co-panelist by Isabel Wilkerson as must reads. And I want to also ask people to read the 2 books that Dr. Jamar Tisby has also penned. And if you have not watched my sister from Nigeria, Chimamanda Adichie Ngozi's book, talk, The Danger of a Single Story, please, friends, please begin there. Thank you for allowing me the time.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you for sharing that with us.
You're so welcome for getting an opportunity to be that person, Chaplain Brooks. It's good to have all of you on here. Here we go with a really huge, deep breath in this wrap up. Ladies and gentlemen, when this conversation first started, we almost grabbed hands and began to sing Kumbaya. Literally, we were all of a sudden seeming to be okay with being umbrellaed under a great monolithic term as just being Blacks in America. And then, of course, it was that one that just finished speaking that said, I thought we were here for tensions. So I'm going to dive right on into this thing and talk about the tensions. Listen, brothers and sisters, some of the things we've come to understand is that this divide and conquer mentality that came over with colonization has caused us to look at each other, to villainize certain aspects and stereotype individuals as a result of how they work, where they come from, how they look, within the African American experience, the Caribbean experience, as well as just the Black experience right here in America. We realized really early in this conversation, but no one was ready to say it until Dr. Pollard said it towards the end, that we actually weren't representing everybody on here. We were actually trying to figure out a way around this. Now, many of us on here have read the various different books that you've seen us talk about. And so we've come to understand some of the things that we just said. But Crichton said it best. We got to slow down for a second and really, really, really begin to dive into this, because he was like, Black is an experience, but being African is an origin. Dr. Jones wasn't afraid to say, listen, when I came here, folks were just like, oh, you're not one of them. You're just not one of them. And you're going to actually, they expected you to behave and do differently. And then, of course, Sanchez let us know, listen, man, that war within and trying to understand some of the things that actually happen within yourself, being that you had family members from here and family members from there, and then trying to understand them. And then we got to the code switching, trying to decide, watch this, which majority or minority you actually belong to. Were you going to accept that stereotype? Or are you going to say, you know what? I'm just Black. Because what I see you all doing here to Black people in America, regardless of where they come from, I can't stand it anymore. But ladies and gentlemen, we figured out we need more time. That's right. We need more time to help educate us. Because as Dr. Woolford-Wint put it, it was actually taught that when you conquer them, or in order to conquer them, divide them. Because if you divide them, you will win. It's been a great conversation, ladies and gentlemen, and we're going to come back next week. As my co-host has said, we're going to be dealing with another topic, but this one is going to come back on the docket. You don't want to miss it. You need to be a part of it. I want to thank everyone who has responded and put some comments in there. There were times I was going to comment and talk about someone else's comment, but as the discussion began to get deeper and the pot began to stir, it was difficult to bring some stuff out. But please, please, please like, share, subscribe, click the notification buttons, because when we bring this topic back, when we go live, you want to go live. Thanks a lot, Doc.
Amen. We're going to close out with a word of prayer. I want to thank our panelists again for being with us on today. I also want to say happy birthday to Doc Jones, Dr. Clifford Jones. It is his birthday today. Happy birthday to you. He's the president of the Lake Region Conference, and it is a privilege to have you here with us today on your birthday, a birthday on the Sabbath nonetheless. So thank you again. May God bless each and every one of you. Let's bow for a word of prayer to close out. Father in heaven, thank you for the way that you have been with us in this conversation. We could barely get to everything because there is so much, but you have definitely gave us a better understanding, and we thank you, Lord. We pray that you would be with the panelists in their various areas of teaching and their various areas of service, that they might be able to teach and direct minds, Lord, so that we all can have a better understanding, and we can get past these tensions, and that we can love each other as brothers and sisters in Christ. Lord, I pray that you would be with all of our viewers as well, and our listeners, that you would bless them and their families, and that you would continue to keep them. And I pray, Lord, that they can share this with others so that we all can grow, but most importantly, we can grow to be more like you. Bless the conversation, Lord, as we try to inspire and as we try to educate at the same time, that we would indeed reach those goals and glorify you. We thank you now in the name of Jesus, we pray. Amen. All right. Thank you, everyone. God bless you, and happy Black History Month.